Okay, we're going to pick up the remainder of Chapter 4 in two videos, and we're going to start right here where we left off in one of the classes. And let's go ahead and bring that up as a full screen. There we go. And the last item regarding emotional development is the effects of excessive stress on emotional development. In fact, this can impair proper development of the hypothalamus, a brain structure that regulates the fight or flight response, also that stimulates the release of a variety of hormones, in many cases through the pituitary gland. And excessive stress may come in the form of abuse, which is an intense short-term stressor, as well as a long-term chronic stressor, as the child also then has a constant fear that the abuse would be repeated. This can have potential long-term effects on a child's emotional development, as it causes an increase in stress hormones. Those high levels of stress hormones then can impact the development of emotional centers in the brain and result in emotional impairment. Okay, now that's interesting. Let's see what's going on here with that. There we go. Okay, we're back to where we need to be. The abuse then may cause the child to respond in an abnormal way to stressors and other stimuli. The child might startle to just minor things, might be hypervigilant, constantly on the lookout for danger, even when they're in a very safe situation. They may also experience periods of unexplained anger or fear, seemingly to no actual stimulus. And on the other hand, they may fail to respond with normal emotional responses to things that normally would cause a response, things that normally a child would find frightening or would become angry. So either an extreme response or a lack of response. We can help prevent excessive stress and abuse by providing new mothers with help, assistance, emotional support, providing that someone can be available should the mother become frustrated or have a difficult time, someone that can step in and take care of the infant for a time. Also, we can prevent excessive stress by involving new fathers in the care of the infant. Again, that gives mom a break. Much of the stress that young children experience is in response to the mother being under stress. We can also avoid excessive stress by strengthening the relationship between mother and father, the couple relationship. Next, let's take a tour of the various theories and what they have to say about emotional and personality development in the first couple years. And we'll start with Freud's psychosexual theory. The psychosexual stages, according to Freud, the mother's interactions with the child throughout the psychosexual stages then are crucial to avoid damaging the child and distorting their personality and their emotional response ongoing. The first stage of Freud's psychoanalytic theory, psychosexual stage, is the oral stage. Child enjoys mouthing things, biting and sucking, chewing on things. However, at some point, they have to learn that they have to control that urge and only do so in a socially acceptable way. And so mom begins to say, well, you can't just put anything in your mouth that you want. You just can't go around biting people whenever you feel like it. And there's also the weaning where the child now has to discontinue breastfeeding or has to give up the bottle. And according to Freud, how the mother goes about this and when may have an impact on the child ongoing. If the mother frustrates the child's oral urges too much, or if the mother is extremely harsh in forcing the weaning process, then the child develops an oral fixation, which then may mean as an adult that the person is at risk for becoming overweight from eating too much, or becoming an alcoholic, drinking too much. Might manifest it by making, say, biting comments that are hurtful to other people, according to Freud, all going back to the first 18 months in this oral stage. The second stage, 18 months through about 3 years, the anal stage, the child, according to Freud, enjoys holding their waist and expelling them, the bowels and bladder. And at this point, again, they run into a crisis, and mom again comes along and says, well, you just can't do that anytime, anywhere. You have to do it here and only at certain times. Toilet training. According to Freud, again, if the mother is too harsh in forcing the toilet training, or if they begin too soon before the child is capable, again, the person's personality is damaged. The person develops an anal retentive personality. As an adult, that would manifest as the person being very stingy, cheap, controlling, a neat freak where things have to be a certain way. Now, for both of these stages, what do we have as scientific evidence to verify Freud's theory? Well, not really much of anything. Scientific evidence to document his theory is pretty thin, so it sort of remains in the realm of theories that have not really been tested. Now, on the other hand, modern research on toilet training can give us some insight there. And they have noted that timing varies greatly by culture, with some cultural groups almost from the very beginning working with the child to establish toilet training, and with some cultural groups seemingly never really making an effort to do that, just waiting until the person picks it up on their own. And what they found is it doesn't seem to be damaging to start the child early, nor does it seem to be damaging to let it go until very late. Behaviorists, you might remember, are those that emphasize our actions being regulated by conditioning and learning, suggest that a parent could accomplish toilet training in one day. When the child is old enough, bodily systems are mature enough to control the bowels and bladder. According to the behaviorist approach, all one has to do is fill the child up with liquids, maybe their favorite juices and so on, and then put them on the potty and keep them on there, and then eventually they're going to have to go. And when they do go on the potty, then the parent begins to reinforce that action by praising the child, by maybe even offering cookies and treats and all kinds of things. And according to this theory, then the child will repeat that behavior of using the potty, and toilet training is accomplished. Now, in interviewing students who are parents, I asked over semesters if any have tried this approach, and some of them have. Now, it turns out that it's pretty rare that it worked out in reality, that this is done in one day, although there was one parent that said, well, took just a couple days. That said, that might not be the same for all children. There may be other factors that intervene. Other research indicated that when parents waited a little bit longer to start the child on toilet training, the child generally learns quicker. And even the difference starting at 24 months as opposed to 27 months, they found 27 months old picked up the whole thing a lot quicker than the 24 months old. So if one wants to simply get it done in a short period of time, it might make sense to wait longer. It's also been noted that often children will watch their older brothers and sisters who have already been toilet trained, and through observational learning may pick this all up on their own. wanting to be like older brothers or sisters. So the bottom line is the modern research suggests that one can start at any point when the child's bodily functions are mature enough and not really worried about damaging the child, simply deciding how to go about it based on what goals they have as to whether it should be they want this to occur earlier, whether they want to get it done quickly, and those sort of things. Now shifting to Erikson's psychoanalytic theory. Again, he believed that we were motivated by unconscious urges for interactions with others, social urges. So in his scheme of things, we have the psychosocial stages, the first of which is trust versus mistrust. The child in the first few months of life is simply learning whether the world is a place that is secure and safe, where others can be trusted, or whether it's a place where one must fear that their needs will not be met or that others will harm them. According to Erikson also, the child's interaction with the mother are key in whether the child ends up with a sense of basic trust or ends up with a sense of mistrust. Adult problems then that might be traced to this stage, according to Erikson, is if the child ends up with a basic sense of mistrust, then they will be, as an adult, suspicious of others, pessimistic as to whether they can get what they need in life. On the other hand, if the parent has been overly attentive to the child, well, then you might actually have developed a sense of being too trusting. And in this case, you might end up with an adult who is gullible, who is too trusting towards others and therefore is taken advantage of. By the way, Erikson suggests that if a mother is reasonably attentive to the child's needs, sees to it that they get fed, that they get changed within a reasonable amount of time, then they should develop a basic sense of trust that's adequate for the rest of their lives. Erikson also includes a second stage beginning in the first couple years that he calls autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy is self-rule, making your own decisions, and children in their second year, 2-year-olds, want to control their body, control their actions, make their own decisions. And so we have the terrible twos where the parent says, do this, and the child does the opposite, wanting to show that they are in control. Now, according to Erikson, what we want is the child to develop, again, a basic sense of autonomy, that they can make their own decisions, control their actions. Parental support, though, is needed in developing that sense of independence, which increases the child's self-confidence and self-efficacy, their belief that they can handle new tasks. According to Erikson, then, the parent can be neither too permissive or too restrictive. If the parent is too permissive, well, then the child never learns to control their actions. They simply do whatever comes to mind. Or, if the parent is too permissive, there's also the potential that the child, in doing whatever they want, gets hurt, and then they simply shut down and they're afraid to do anything. On the other hand, if the parent is too restrictive, the child never gets to make any choices of their own, never gets to practice autonomy, making their own decisions. Now, you might ask, well, then how does a parent kind of navigate between these two extremes? One way to do that is the parent offers the child safe options. So they ask the child, would you like to play with this friend today or that friend? Would you like to wear the red t-shirt or the blue one? Would you like to play with this toy or that one? All of them are safe options. The child gets to make their own choices, developing a sense of independence, self-rule. Now, according to Erikson, then, if the child doesn't develop this sense of autonomy, then they are left with a sense of shame and doubt. They're ashamed that they're unable to make their own decisions and that they lack self-control. As an adult, they may lack confidence, feel inadequate. They may end up dependent on others to make the decisions for them, difficulty making their own decisions. We can also observe that there are cultural differences in what parents actually reinforce when it comes to these things. In some cultures, like American culture, we tend to reinforce autonomy and encourage the child to make some of their own choices. In other cultural groups, they may encourage actually the child to develop a greater sense of shame and doubt, particularly in cultures where they are very group-based, and it's very important that each individual does their part on the behalf of the group. So in those cultures, they may actually discourage autonomy on the child's part and emphasize a sense of shame and doubt. Our next theory, back to behaviorism. Behaviorists believe that the parents mold the child's emotional responses and their personality traits by reinforcing certain emotional responses and personality traits and punishing others. So essentially, then, the child becomes what the parent creates, according to John Watson, one of the early behaviorists. Now, we probably can observe this to some extent in real life. On the other hand, many of us would also suggest that that's not the entire story. The child, also being a thinking being, might in some cases not completely respond to those reinforcements and punishments. But we have to admit that reinforcement and punishment of various traits and responses, pretty powerful. Social learning theory would suggest that the child develops their various typical behaviors and traits, personality, by watching others and then modeling the behavior of certain individuals. One of the things that then regulates whether they will imitate what they see is the consequences of the observed behavior. If the child observes that a person is punished for a certain behavior, they avoid imitating that. If they see it being rewarded, that's what they'll imitate. Now take, for example, maybe a situation where dad always gets what he wants when he gets angry. What's the child going to model? Well, he sees dad gets what he wants, so when the child wants something, well, they're going to imitate that angry behavior. We also have learned that children will model their behavior on those that they want to be like, that they admire, look up to, and of course in that first couple of years, the parent is sort of like God to the child, who's more powerful and more desirable, but mom or dad, and so they also will more readily imitate their behavior, and maybe secondarily their older brothers and sisters. They may also imitate their behavior very readily. Cognitive theory would suggest that our typical emotional responses as well as our personality traits are influenced or even determined by the thoughts we think, our values, our beliefs, the schema that we've formed. Schema being sort of how do we think things work. According to this theory, then, a child's early relationships may become working models, a schema then that the child applies to other relationships ongoing. So if the child's early working model is people are dangerous, well, they'll probably be suspicious of others. If it is that people can be trusted, well, then they probably will find it easy to form friendships and relationships. Now, the cognitive theory, though, suggests that it's not the person's experience alone that determine the person's schema thoughts, values, and so forth, but it's also the interpretation of the experience, the child's perception of that experience. Two children can have the very same experience, one interpreting it as being a frightening experience and the other interpreting it as being very exciting. And of course, then the effect of that experience is going to be completely opposite because their interpretations or perceptions of it are completely different. According to this theory also, schemas and beliefs can be altered, and even memories can be reinterpreted to alter our early models. Even if a child is abused, they may later on reframe that experience. And rather than seeing themselves lifelong as a victim of abuse, they may alter that perception of the event to see themselves as a survivor of the abuse. And having survived that abuse, that they have gained important strengths and insights into life that they would not otherwise have. So this suggests that the effects of experience can be altered through various new ways of thinking. Cognitive theory would also suggest that ethno-theories influence the child's emotional and personality development. Ethno-theories being sort of mini-theories based on cultural beliefs. For example, in some cultures, it is believed that children are actually the person's parents' ancestors who have been reincarnated into that child. In these cultures, then, children are treated with a high level of respect, just like one would treat an elderly person. And rather than the parent believing that they're there to teach the child, they believe they're there to learn from the child who's actually one of their ancestors. So this also alters how the child thinks or influences how they see themselves. Epigenetic theory emphasizes the interaction of our inherited traits with our experience and environment. One of the areas where this is important is that of temperament. Temperament is defined as a constitutionally based, inborn individual difference. So constitutionally based, in other words, that it's just something we're born with, something that is likely highly genetic. An individual difference. We observe differences in people almost from the very beginning. Now, in what areas? Well, emotional response. Even very early on, some infants become upset easily. It doesn't take much to get them upset. And when they get upset, they stay that way for a long time. They have a very intense response to that unpleasant situation. Others, the emotional response is much milder. They may not respond to a whole lot of things with the emotional response, and when it is, it may be mild, doesn't last long. We also note individual differences in activity level, even with children in the first few days of life. Some are very active, some very passive, some in between. And then self-regulation, the ability to control one's actions. In babies, this would be manifested as an ability to soothe oneself, calm down once upset. In classes, I always ask parents that are in the class who had more than one child, how soon could you tell that these children were going to be different in their personality traits? Well, I call it personality traits, in the way that they respond emotionally, how active they are, ability to soothe themselves. And most of the time, those parents will say, well, from the very beginning, they were very different. And so we see this very early on. Now, temperament and personality seem a bit similar, and indeed they may overlap in a number of areas. But temperament seems to be less alterable than personality traits, although both of these are highly stable, tend to be quite consistent from infancy all the way into adulthood. The New York longitudinal study, the NYLS, studied many infants and categorized them according to temperament. And they ended up categorizing 40% as easy. These are infants that mild emotional response, moderately active, easy to soothe, and so on. Then 15% were considered slow to warm up. Anything that was new or different would upset them for a short time or cause them to become hesitant, but it didn't take long and they adapted and did fine. Then they also considered 10% to be difficult, and these infants got upset easily. They were stayed upset. The emotional response was intense. They were extremely active, couldn't settle down. Also, they were not able to get on a consistent feeding and sleeping schedule, difficult to work with. Now, what they found then, and as following up on these infants year after year, that most of them in the easy category continue to be that way in terms of their temperament. Again, the same with the slow to warm up and difficult babies. So the difficult baby most of the time would be continue to be somewhat difficult to work with into childhood, adolescence, even in adulthood. Now, whereas those were fairly stable, they did see that there was some possibility of changing from one category to another, and particularly in infant and early childhood, it's possible that those who were of a difficult temperament or slow to warm up could shift to easier temperament. Particularly, they believe the parent's role was important if this is to happen. In one study, inhibited, fearful babies were able to become less fearful, quicker to respond to new situations if the parents were highly nurturing and were able to establish a very secure bond with the child. Now, these temperaments also suggest that goodness of fit with the child's caregiver is important as well, caretaker, whether that's a mother or somebody else. Consider, for example, if we have a child who has an easy temperament, well, then whether their mother is of an easy temperament or difficult doesn't make much difference. They can work with the easy temperament. Baby can work fine with anybody. They don't get upset easily, even if the other person does, the parent does. On the other hand, if we have a baby who has a difficult temperament, unfortunately, there's a good likelihood that their mother also has a difficult temperament, as we've seen that temperament is pretty strongly genetic. Now there we have a recipe for trouble. Either mom or baby gets easily upset. Once they're upset, the other becomes upset. Now the other becomes more upset, and the whole thing spirals until things get out of hand. In a case like this, then, it's suggested, where we have a difficult baby and mom is on the difficult side when it comes to temperament, that we make sure that there's someone else available who can step in when things are getting rough and can take over the care of the child until mom has a chance to get some rest, calm down, de-stress a bit. Very important. Now, just to give a brief description of the big 5 personality traits, and you'll see how these differ somewhat from temperament. Big 5 personality traits is one of the most common ways of characterizing personality, and we can observe and test people for these traits starting in childhood all the way through adulthood. The first one, openness to experience, indicates an interest in things that are new and different, novel, person that scores high in openness experience likes a lot of new experiences, trying different things. On the other hand, a person that would score low on the openness scale, they don't like a lot of new ideas or new activities. They sort of like routine things better. They sort of like to stick with what they know. Conscientiousness, second on our list. Conscientiousness. People that score high on conscientiousness are people who are do things the right way, you might say. They pay attention to details. When they promise to do something, they follow through. They show up to work on time. They get things done by the deadlines. On the other hand, those who score low on conscientiousness don't sweat the details at all. You can't expect that they're going to do things when they say. They're not too concerned about showing up on time or getting things done by deadlines. In fact, they may even be kind of sloppy in their work. Obviously, most employers prefer employees that are kind of on the conscientious side, although even then, a person might be too conscientious. In fact, the person might be so focused on details and doing things exactly right that they don't get much of anything done. It is possible that a person is too conscientious. Third on our list, extroversion. Well, you've probably heard of people who are extroverts, and they like to interact with others. They're very social. They like to spend time with others, and they enjoy doing things. Now, the opposite end of that scale then would be introversion, the introvert being a person that is more inwardly focused, more into thinking than doing, more into introspection, looking within. Fourth on the list, agreeableness, just what it sounds like. A person that scores high on this is cooperative, easy to work with, has warm feelings towards others. The opposite of that scale, the person is disagreeable. They don't like other people. They're hard to get along with. They're uncooperative, maybe even ruthless, where they will take advantage of other people, maybe malicious, where they will do mean things. Neuroticism, last on our list, denotes emotional instability. The person that scores high on neuroticism is a neurotic person, has a lot of unpleasant emotional feelings, spends a lot of time in those kinds of states. Also, they may be up and down with their emotions as well, emotionally unstable. The individual who scores low in neuroticism, calm, easygoing, nothing bothers them. Now, moving to social cultural theory and what it might have to say about the development of our personality traits. One of the areas studied under social cultural theory would be the effects of proximal versus distal parenting. Proximal parenting is where the parent expresses a great deal of closeness with the child, picking the child up, holding them much of the time, speaking to them, so forth. Distal parenting, more distant, less contact with the child physically as well as emotionally. Studies of two different groups showed that these two types of parenting produce different personality traits. Study of the Nassau group in rural Cameroon, Africa. These parents were very proximal parents, holding their children much of the time, interacting with them constantly. They were compared with a group of parents and children from urban Greece, Athens, Greece. These parents were quite distal. They did not spend a whole lot of time holding their children or in physical contact or conversing with the child. What they found is the children of the Nassau group, who had the more proximal parenting, were more obedient towards the parent, less likely to go against the parent's wishes, However, they were somewhat less self-aware, didn't know as much about themselves. On the other hand, the Greek children who had the distal parenting were less compliant. They were more likely to disobey the parent. However, they were more self-aware. They did know themselves somewhat better. So I guess you can kind of take your pick and sort of mold personality traits of those sorts. And by the way, within a cultural group, they also compared within that cultural group children that received more proximal or distal parenting and found the same patterns even within cultural groups. Cultural practices also may influence a number of phenomena like separation anxiety. Researchers noticed that Japanese children had more pronounced separation anxiety than German infants, and they began comparing the two cultures and found that Japanese parents were very proximal, spent a long time each day in physical contact with the child. The Germans, on the other hand, tended to be pretty standoffish. In fact, German mothers in smaller towns would even leave their children in strollers out in front of stores as they went in to shop and then would come back out and pick them up. So children, you might say, adapted. And if they had very proximal parenting, they expected to be in close proximity to the parent, as the Japanese did. And when separated, it was more of a difficulty to them. On the other hand, the German infants had habituated, you might say, to spending time separated from the parent and were less prone to severe separation anxiety. So cultural practices also may influence the personality traits of the individual. Now we'll move next to the development of social bonds, the formation of close relationships between individuals, and this is a good time to revisit this idea of goodness of fit. When we have parenting that is appropriate for a baby's temperament, then we say this is a good fit between the baby and the parent. With a good fit between baby and parent, then parents of difficult babies can build close relationships, bonds with them, even though those infants have more difficulty bonding. Parents that have fearless and curious infants also can learn to protect them from harm. These two types of temperaments have to be treated differently by the parent. Parents who have toddlers that are slow to warm up can also help them by preparing them for new and different events ahead of time, telling them about them, what they're going to experience, and then giving them time to adjust to new situations. So we can adjust the parenting to produce a goodness of fit with the baby's temperament. Social bonds develop in part through the development of synchrony. Synchrony would be learning the timing and responsiveness of interactions with others. If you've ever had a conversation with someone where they always began speaking whenever you began speaking, and then of course after a while you give up and you say, well, I'll just be quiet and I'll let them say whatever they want, and then you find they don't say anything either and you have this dead silence. If you ever had that, you've experienced a lack of synchrony in interacting with them. Now, this skill actually develops within the first year, starting in about the third month. And what helps babies to develop a sense of synchrony is the games of emotional imitation, where the mother or adult makes various facial expressions imitating the child. Child responds back, so we get a back and forth responding. Children also begin to learn how to read the various facial expressions through that emotional imitation, and they learn from the adult responses, but they also learn kind of the timing of the back and forth sort of synchrony. Now, children actually expect this back and forth response from adults, In one experiment that was called the still face experiments, mothers were part of this experiment with their babies, and they were told to interact back and forth with emotional imitation. But then when a certain signal was given, the mom was supposed to just put a blank facial expression, no emotion, and lo and behold, the infants became perturbed that there was no response from the adult to their emotional expression. They didn't like it. They seemed to expect that the adult was going to respond back. We have learned then that face-to-face play with infants, then interaction with them, stimulates brain development as well as the skill of synchrony. We'll stop right there, and then on the final video for the chapter, then we'll take up the topic of attachment as well as various attachment patterns that can be observed, predictors of attachment style, how attachment patterns in early childhood and infancy may influence later on relationships in adolescence and adulthood, social referencing, father care, and infant daycare. So that's what's coming up on the last part. Thanks, and that's it for this section.